welcome to New Jersey Politics with Laura Jones. I am Laura Jones, and we are so glad to have you here. Coming up today, we're going to be talking about immigration. Here in New Jersey, the ACLU is working on passing a bill called the Immigrant Trust Act, and we're going to be diving into that later on in the show. First, though, we are going to be talking about a development in New Jersey's cannabis landscape. A new legislative proposal could fast-track the transition of medical cannabis dispensaries into the recreational market by bypassing the need for municipal approval. The move aims to counter local resistance to cannabis sales. Joining us to unpack all the legal implications is Joshua Bachner, who chairs the Cannabis, Hemp, and Psychedelic Practice at Mandelbaum Barrett PC in Roseland, New Jersey. Joshua, good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, let's get down to it. Can you explain how this bill, which is sponsored by the Senate President Nick Scutari, would legally enable medical cannabis dispensaries to sell recreational marijuana without local consent?
Sure. So when the cannabis legislation called CREMA was originally passed, it provided for home rule, which allows each of the 565 townships in the state of New Jersey to elect to opt in if they want to permit cannabis within their boundaries. And that could be for a dispensary, it could be for a cultivation facility, a processing facility, what have you. And what we discovered was that was really creating a lot of hurdles to creating a safe and regulated market in the state. Many of the municipalities had created their own independent approval process that was often more cumbersome than the Cannabis Regulatory Commission's process at the state level. And it slowed things down dramatically. It actually engendered a lot of litigation. And frankly, many folks at the local level just didn't know how to properly evaluate a cannabis applicant. They don't have any knowledge in this space. It was all ostensibly done through the municipal land use law, which gives townships in New Jersey considerable control over zoning. So in light of that concern, what Senator Scutari's proposed legislation does is it eliminates municipal review for already established operators within a township. So if there's a medical dispensary, for example, in a township, and they want to convert to also permit adult use sales, they don't have to again go through that municipal review process.
All right, and New Jersey, being that home rule state that it is, what is the reaction, or what do you anticipate the reaction is going to be from municipalities that have been using these zoning laws to stop the business? And again, these local municipalities, people like how things are. They certainly don't like the state coming in and saying, not so fast.
I think it's going to be favorable. What we've seen from the normalization of cannabis legalization is the townships are actually happy to have these businesses operating within their boundaries. They receive significant tax revenue. We're taking previously vacant property. It's now being taxed. We're creating commercial opportunity, employment opportunity within the townships. So I think there's actually not going to be significant resistance. We've also seen a significant number of townships opt in over the past couple of years. So many townships, originally there were only 17% that opted in. Today there's about a third in the state. Townships are really taking a wait and see approach. Is this going to work? Is the sky going to fall? Are we going to have sales to minors, an increase in driving under the influence, crime, what have you? And that hasn't happened. And in fact, I think a lot of the townships recognize that this has been good for them and good for their citizenry. So I don't anticipate a lot of resistance. Of course, when you do have 565 townships in the state, there's always going to be some folks that aren't going to be happy with it. And it still is cannabis. I mean, it's certainly a hot, sometimes toxic topic. And people can be very strong opinions on it one way or the other.
Well, that's it. There are certain issues, certain topics that you're just going to have to agree to disagree, or you're going to get ugly. Do you anticipate some potential legal challenges, though? Is this setting a slippery slope that could arise from the legislation from a town saying the state can't come in and and undo what we have in place? They can't come in and step on our toes.
There's the possibility of litigation, but the state can, in fact, do this. The state's the one that passes the laws, and obviously the townships are subsets of the state. There's likely to be litigation. There usually is in New Jersey, but I will tell you, there's been a lot of litigation arising from home rule against the townships, and townships have spent considerable sums defending against their approving one applicant over another. I've been involved in many myself. And I think that's simply a lot of wasted tax revenue going to pay attorneys and doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's held up the market. We were discussing before we came on that you have a dispensary in your home township that still hasn't operated, hasn't
Right.
begun operations. And a lot of townships are seeing that problem as well. They've approved applicant A, and 2, 3 years later, applicant A still hasn't started operations. And applicant B, who was rejected, is still waiting in the wings, eager to get going, eager to open up their store, to start employing people, pay that tax revenue to the township. And so I think a lot of the townships are now regretting some of their original decisions, and hopefully we'll welcome this.
Yeah.
Again, these are not bypassing the home rule to place adult dispensaries in a town where there's already not a medical dispensary operating. So it really only impacts a very small number of folks, but it does allow for that conversion. And what
Right.
we're seeing with the advent of the adult use market is, of course, a decrease in the medical market. There were at one point over 150,000 medical patients in the state, and we're now down to about 68,000. And
Wow.
that's simply because it's much easier to avoid having to get a medical license when you could just purchase in the adult use market. It's more expensive because it's taxed at a higher rate, but the product is, for all intents and purposes, the same.
Do you seem to still be fighting a battle over the perception? As we were just mentioning, by the way, my township, West Amwell, Hunterdon County, is there still a perception battle that you are having to continue to wage with individuals who are still saying, you know, I remember when weed was illegal, you know, people went to jail. It's a gateway drug. It's going to attract the wrong kinds of people. Well, now you're going to make it recreational. Now young people can get to it. Can you talk to a little bit about those concerns? Because they're valid concerns for the people who have these concerns.
They are valid concerns, certainly. The reality is the licensed dispensary operators are incredibly conscientious about not selling to minors because they have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in establishing their operations, and they're not going to put that license at risk. My clients and most of the folks I know in the industry in New Jersey and beyond are very sensitive to that issue. And what people are starting to appreciate is the history of cannabis criminalization is really focused on racism. I mean, quite candidly. Back in 1939, a gentleman by the name of Harry Aslinger, who didn't frankly like certain minority demographics, determined that cannabis needed to be criminalized and did that through the Marijuana Tax Act. And then if you fast forward to the Nixon administration, which is what passed the Controlled Substances Act, Nixon had two groups that he didn't like, African Americans and hippies. And so, against the guidance of his advisors, he actually commissioned the governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Schaefer, to issue what became known as the Schaefer Report, to conclude that cannabis was a gateway drug and that it was toxic and addictive. And Governor Schaefer issued a report that concluded just the opposite. Nixon rejected that. Cannabis became a Schedule 1 controlled substance, a conclusion which would indicate it has no medicinal value whatsoever. And for the past 50 years, we've been fighting, frankly, Nixon's misbegotten conclusion regarding cannabis. And when you look, there are 38 states that have legalized medical marijuana, plus the District of Columbia, Guam, and you then have the federal government finding that there's no viable medicinal use for marijuana. That's some cognitive dissonance that it's hard to get your head around.
Yeah.
So that racist history and the stigma that's been associated with cannabis, going all the way back to reefer madness, is really one that I think people are starting to have to reconcile with. And we're seeing that particularly with the focus on expungements. As you pointed out, for 100 years, we've been locking up people for selling dime bags, and more often than not, again, minority communities. Now it's legalized. People are still in jail. But a bunch, frankly, of rich white guys got into the space. All of a sudden, it's terrific news. These people are still suffering incarceration.
Yeah,
And it's been very important.
that's exactly what I was going to. People are still in jail for this, which is now legal. I want to talk about another part of this debate, this discussion, when I was doing a little research, and that is for those who get their medical marijuana through these dispensaries. What about those people who are concerned about the quality going down? It's almost like you've got the name brand, now you're going to have a generic for recreational use that you don't need a medical card. Is there a concern that by providing both, that the quality of the medical marijuana for people who need it for their treatment, that quality is going to go down?
There was initially, and a lot of us were very concerned about depleting the supply in the medical market when adult use came online. But what we've discovered is that hasn't happened. Like I mentioned, there's actually been a significant decrease in medical licensed registrants because they're simply purchasing the adult use product, which again is for all intents and purposes the same. It's just taxed at a different rate. Many dispensaries were required by the CRC to maintain hours where they would just service medical patients, and they were empty during those time periods. So it is a legitimate concern. I think it's been successfully addressed, and we haven't really seen that issue. That said, there is another concern, which is supply in general. Because of the federal prohibition, you can't transport cannabis across state lines. So if you have a supply problem, as we do, frankly, in New Jersey, there's insufficient supply. You can't take product from, say, California, which has a significant supply, and bring it into the state. It has to be grown here. And so what we're seeing with the advent of the adult use market is supply and demand issues. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that a cultivation facility is very expensive to develop and become operational, particularly when you consider cannabis licensees don't have access to traditional financing from commercial banks because of that federal prohibition. Yeah. So it's very hard to come up with $15 million to create a cultivation facility if you can't go to the bank and borrow the money.
Right. Final thoughts here. If this passes, from a legal standpoint, how do you see this actually shaking out, affecting consumers, affecting local communities, and the people that they serve?
I think it's going to be very beneficial for consumers, and I think that's why Senator Scutari is so interested in passing this bill. Like I mentioned, it really only impacts a very few townships where there's already a medical licensee operating. It gives them the opportunity to serve a wider consumer base by now selling adult use. I think it is going to be welcomed by consumers for that reason. There's still insufficient dispensaries throughout the state to serve the population, so it's just providing greater access, whether it's for medicinal use or adult use. And let's not forget, at the end of the day, cannabis makes you happy. Being happy is health.
All right. Joshua, we thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. The ACLU of New Jersey recently held a press conference in Newark calling for the swift adoption of the Immigrant Trust Act to bolster immigration protections. Joining us now to talk about this legislation is Ami Kachalia, campaign strategist at the ACLU-NJ. Ami, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Laura.
Yes, could you briefly summarize what the Immigrant Trust Act aims to achieve for New Jersey's immigrants?
Yes. The Immigrant Trust Act is legislation that aims to make sure that all people in New Jersey, regardless of their immigration status, can safely and comfortably access state and local government agencies. So regardless of whether or not someone's trying to register for public school for their child or sign up for health care, to report wage theft or to report domestic violence, whatever it may be, we want to make sure that they can do so without worrying that that interaction with a government agency is going to lead to detention, deportation, or family separation. This is an important part of making sure that all New Jerseyans feel comfortable accessing their government, and importantly, it makes sure that resources that we as a state have made sure people are eligible are actually reaching the people that they are meant to reach.
What are you hearing in your offices right now? There's a lot of information going on out there. A lot of people are very concerned, very worried. Is there misinformation out there? What are you hearing in your office?
You know, right now people are very concerned. They're definitely watching what's happening at the federal level in terms of attacks on immigrant communities. They're hearing about plans to have the largest mass deportation effort in the nation's history. They're hearing about plans to really dramatically expand the footprint for immigration detention in New Jersey and across the country. And so there is a lot of fear, and we hear very frequently, ever since inauguration, of ICE raids, of ICE presence in communities. And we know that's the chilling impact that we're seeing now on the ground. You know, we hear from parents who are scared to send their children to school, of people who are worried about going to work. We hear from teachers a lot who are really scared about and worried about how they can protect their students. And so across the board in different sectors, people are fearful, but they really want to help, and they really want to make sure that their family, their friends, and their neighbors are protected.
Yeah. You recently held a press conference up in Newark. The mayor of Newark, Roz Baraka, has come out very strongly in support of protecting immigrants, very, very concerned. Can you talk about the urgency to pass this act in New Jersey, where you have a lot of mayors and elected officials saying nothing, we don't want anything to happen. So what is it about the urgency of this particular act, and what specific protections does it offer?
Yes, of course. And you're right. We have seen so much support for the Immigrant Trust Act. There are many mayors on board, but we also have almost a third of the legislature that has signed on in support of this bill. And people know that there's a need. Almost every time we talk to lawmakers, they themselves have a constituent story that they share back with us. And so right now, in terms of urgency, we know that there's a lot of attacks coming to immigrant communities at the federal level. And it's more important than ever that New Jersey do what they can, what's in our authority to protect people here. And so if we can protect people from actually getting into the pipeline for immigration, detention, and deportation, that's how we can help families stay together. And that's exactly what the Immigrant Trust Act would do.
And during the press event that you held up in Newark, you were talking about the ACLU New Jersey was talking about a day of action. What is that about? What are the activities that are going to be happening around the state?
We actually just had our day of action on the Immigrant Trust Act, and it was all about making sure that every single lawmaker in the state heard from their local community members about the need for the Immigrant Trust Act. And so we and partners across the state visited almost every single legislative district office with a call to action for the Immigrant Trust Act and with that urgency that you mentioned, because people don't want this in a couple months' time or in a couple years' time. We don't have time to wait. And any day without the Immigrant Trust Act is a day that New Jersey isn't doing everything it can to stand with immigrant community members. That's the message we took to everyone.
So when you have something like the Immigrant Trust Act, how does that address the actual trust factor between immigrant communities and public service, public officials, government, even when government is, local officials might be saying, we support you. How do you bridge that gap? And can you talk about that trust factor and why that's so crucial?
Of course, and that's so important, right? A couple of years ago in New Jersey, we actually passed a directive called the Immigrant Trust Directive. It came from the Office of the Attorney General, and that was the exact premise that if people don't trust law enforcement because they're scared that law enforcement are cooperating with ICE, how will they report a crime? How will they share information if they've witnessed something that they need to share? And that's true across the board. We want to make sure that people can access services. And so a big part of that is making sure we are being cautious about how and when we collect information on immigration status and how and when we share it out. At the end of the day, everyone should be able to access government and the services for which they're eligible without worrying that somehow that's going to end up with detention or deportation. We do unfortunately have stories, of people who went to register for healthcare, a gentleman who went to register his newborn for healthcare and had ICE show up a couple of days later. Those are real stories. And when they get around community, it means that people have less trust. And it means that then we have less safe communities, less healthy communities, less secure communities. For all of us to succeed, we need to make sure that we are protecting immigrant communities in New Jersey. I just want to say that it's really important because immigrants make up a large proportion of New Jersey. 1 in 4 New Jerseyans are immigrants. 1 in 6 New Jerseyans are U.S.-born residents with an immigrant parent. We have a lot of mixed status families here. And so this is not a niche issue. This is not a small proportion of our state. This is a large group of folks in our state, and they're a part of our community, and it is time to act.
Yeah, and there are definite nuances, or maybe there isn't a lot of clarification, or again, where the misinformation comes out, because there are individuals who are not here legally, who are a danger to their communities, who need to be removed. And, somebody might be an immigrant and, in the segment before we were talking about the legalization of marijuana, maybe they have something on their criminal record from the past when having marijuana was a crime. That shows up on their record. They could be in for a heap of trouble. So how do you navigate through some of those nuances? Because there are some individuals that need to be out of this country, and there are others who might fall into a little bit of a gray area or have something on their record. Like I said, the marijuana is a perfect example. How many years ago that was illegal, that's on their record, they could be deported.
That's a great question. And I think one thing that's really important for us to talk about this in this conversation is the roles that separate systems play. And so actually, when it comes to violations of criminal law, the people that are responsible for that are actually New Jersey state and local law enforcement. And that is why in our state, we have law and practice that is aimed at that. And so if there is something that may or may not have happened, it is the responsibility of police to investigate. People then, of course, go through the court system. They may be prosecuted. There may be consequences, be it incarceration or otherwise. But that is the responsibility of the state. And really, what we're talking about here with the Immigrant Trust Act is saying, let's actually let law enforcement do their job. Instead of spending their time on immigration enforcement, they should be focusing on their communities and using their resources to focus on community priorities.
So what's the response been from local law enforcement? What's response been from those in Trenton, lawmakers so far? And if there are obstacles that you're facing?
You know, when it comes to response, what we've seen time and time again is that people deeply understand the need for this bill. We've had a lot of lawmakers, as I mentioned earlier, who every time we speak with them about this bill say, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know why this is important. This thing happened in my community. I wish I'd been able to help this family, et cetera, et cetera. And New Jersey, like I mentioned earlier, also has had the Immigrant Trust Directive in place for over 5 years, which means that law enforcement in New Jersey have actually been trying to work on this idea of needing to build trust with the immigrant community. And it's been something we've had in place for quite a while with success. So we know that it works here in New Jersey. We just need to make sure that we're strengthening those protections and that we're codifying it into law.
There are some people who are watching who are saying, listen, if you didn't do anything wrong, you've got nothing to fear. They see it as a very black and white issue. Don't break the law, abide by our rules. Can you share any personal stories, like you mentioned the one about a gentleman with his child? Can you share any personal stories or cases that highlight the need for this legislation in New Jersey? What are what might people be missing or not understanding in the narrative here?
Certainly. You know, we hear stories all the time of people who are nervous about accessing state and local government. And there's a lot of resources for which people are already eligible. Things like driver's licenses, like accessing public schools, like reporting a crime or seeking help from law enforcement should they need it. And we unfortunately hear time and time again of people who are deterred from accessing those resources because they're worried about potential immigration collaboration. You know, one thing we've heard, for example, from partners who work with survivors of domestic violence is that oftentimes those survivors were deterred from calling law enforcement because they worried about potential ramifications when it came to immigration. And so oftentimes these things might sound reasonable on paper, but it's important to understand the actual implications of what we're talking about. It's also important to note that the vast majority of cooperation that can happen between state and local law enforcement and ICE is strictly voluntary. And so what the Immigrant Trust Act does is it says when it's mandatory under federal law for states to comply, right, when there is a warrant, states have to comply. But in all the other instances, let's as a state do what we can to create trust and to protect our neighbors and our friends by not engaging in voluntary cooperation with ICE.
I want to ask about the next steps. If this act is not passed, what are the next steps in the immediate future and your plan for continued advocacy?
As a movement, and this is not just the ACLU of New Jersey, right? When we did our day of action, we were with 60 plus immigrants' rights organizations across the state, all focused on getting the Immigrant Trust Act passed into law. And so that is a priority right now. It's in addition to many other priorities that people have. People are working on everything from legal representation for people who are detained and facing deportation in order to keep families together, and a whole host of other things. People are also on the ground in their communities doing Know Your Rights presentations, organizing, and more. So, you know, immigrants' rights organizations, community organizations are doing everything they can in this moment to stand with their communities, to do everything they can to protect them. What we are calling for here is for our state to step up and lead as well and pass this legislation.
Okay, Ami, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate all of your information, insight, and perspective.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Next week, we start our series Speaking with the Candidates for New Jersey Governor. We invited every candidate to come on the show. Up first, Democrat Steve Fulop, the mayor of Jersey City, and Republican Ed Durr, former state senator. Here's a preview of our conversations. What concretes can you take if elected governor to address the affordability in New Jersey and help ease the burden on New Jersey families?
Well, as you said, it's the issue. And I think it's the number one and it's the only issue because everything works off of the affordability. If you can't afford to pay your utilities, your gas, your mortgage, nothing else really matters. As I said before, I think one of the biggest problems New Jersey has is we have a spending problem. We spend like drunken sailors. You see it yesterday with Governor Murphy. He went and passed a budget that is now $58.1 billion. That's what, almost $23 billion over what Governor Christie had in just under 7 years. That is unsustainable. We cannot continue to go down this road. We have to keep the businesses and the companies here and constantly raising taxes and raising the affordability problem.
Yeah.
So I would address that by cutting the spending, cutting the budget, and cutting taxes to bring companies back.
And I think being a mayor is a different set of skill sets and qualifications for understanding what drives property taxes in New Jersey. There's a couple of things that you could do right out of the gate to change New Jersey. Number one is I think transparency on the budget is a problem, how the budget process works generally in Trenton. Sunlight cleanses that. I think it's really important. Number two is unfunded mandates. Being a mayor, you see a lot of well-intentioned things come out of Trenton, and there's no carrot and stick tied to implementation of that, which ultimately leads to property taxes going up. I think you need to address that. Third is the school funding formula. I think that's a big driver of property taxes. You need a governor that's bold and willing to get into that. And then fourth is, you pay a corruption tax in New Jersey. It's not a pleasant thing, but you see it time and time again on how New Jersey operates, and I think that there's an opportunity for change around that, and that will drive down taxes as well.
What do you mean the corruption tax?
Well, I think that the way that the line system and the ballots have worked for a long time in New Jersey, it's driven lobbyists and party bosses to dictate who and what holds office.
And that's going to do it for today. I'm Laura Jones. Thanks so much for watching New Jersey Politics. We look forward to seeing you back here next time.